Ivan Doig is a Montana author, well-known Montana author of 16 memoirs and novels. He was raised here in Montana and spent his adult life in Seattle, but continued to come back to Montana and wrote many books that are beloved, like This House of Sky, English Creek, Dancing at the Rascal Fair, many others that are highly, highly regarded by people around the world. The collection is big, and I'd like to actually introduce the Dean of the Libraries, Kenning Arlich, who was very instrumental in getting this collection. Kenning, would you like to talk about that?
Sure. So Ivan Doig passed away in April of 2015, and in August of 2015, my associate dean, Brian Rossman, and I traveled out to Seattle to visit with Carol Doig at her invitation and talked to her a little bit about what we could do if she decided to deposit the collection with us. We came back, we wrote a proposal, and a key feature of our proposal was that we said we would digitize the entire collection in less than a year. And so because it's digitized, the entire thing is available on the internet for anyone in the world to view.
Primarily we have documents. We have a lot of sound recordings. We have a lot of photographs, diary entries, obviously many, many book manuscripts. For some of the books we have as many as 7 manuscript versions. And so a lot of evidence of the writer's process, medical records, and we'll talk about all of that. One thing that stayed steady all of his writing life was that he loved manual typewriters. We have many, many photographs of him in the archive at a different model of manual typewriter, not an electric, a manual. And I have a couple of them here that are in the archive that were gifted to us. One of them is a desk model, and you know, it's a standard Royal typewriter that we know he used in stationary settings. We also have, however, one of his portable typewriters. And this is actually my favorite because it tells us a lot about Ivan Doig himself, in my opinion. You look at this and you think, if you owned this, you might actually throw this out. But what it tells us is that Ivan was incredibly frugal. He used everything. This is his bungee cord, by the way. He used everything until it fell apart, essentially. So you have an Olivetti cover on what is not an Olivetti. Well, it is an Olivetti. Olivetti Latera 22, 1950s portable typewriter. And it's held together with duct tape, etc. Has the correcting tape still in it. We have photos of him using typewriters like this, if not this exact one, when he's out on the road doing his research. He made many, many research trips into Montana from his home in Seattle as he was writing his books, because to him it was incredibly important to get everything right. So what he would do is go out and listen to people talking and observe things and come back to his room, or in some cases the Winnebago he might have rented, and type out what his notes were for the day. And it tells us so much about his devotion to getting things right, his devotion to writing, and the feeling he had that words come from the hands. In fact, he writes about this, and in one place he writes an essay about his love of a manual typewriter. And he interestingly says that when he interviews with people and they come to his home, he has to hide his manual typewriter because the interviewer often becomes fixated and wants to characterize him as a Luddite. So if a manual typewriter is in the room, it has to be put away because that should not be the focus. He did write on computers, but he loved these. So we're happy to have these in our collection. He also had a constant habit of thinking of writing and thinking of jotting things down as he was out in the world. So we have a box of his pocket notebooks. Imagine the old pocket protectors that you might have and think of the geekiest person you can think of. And you can imagine Ivan walking around with one of these and a pen or a pencil. And they were omnipresent. In fact, friends would say, you better be careful what you say around Ivan because you may end up in one of his notebooks. And from there, you might end up in one of his books, something you say. Right next to this, we have some of his note cards. And this is one of my favorite boxes of note cards. This is, the divisions within it speak volumes. Montana lingo, cussing, jokes, bars and brothels, drinking. And you think, well, why was he so focused on that? Well, he's using some of this for a book titled The Bartender's Tale. It's a novel that is focused around a bar in rural Montana and characters within it. And you've got him noting things like, he went out of there like a skunk dog, or I haven't learned this much since my 3rd year in 2nd grade. So he's listening. What Ivan would do is find the geezer's table in any cafe in rural Montana, sit as close to it as he could, and he would take notes about how the real people talked, spoke with each other, what were their sayings. He would write them down, and they would become part of the real dialogue of his characters in his next book. So these cards, of which there are thousands within the archive, reflect that kind of attention to detail. Next to it, so we're kind of looking at a progression here. We have the notebooks, and we have note cards, and of course there were other manuscript versions, handwritten and typed. And for each of these books, we have sometimes as many as 7 manuscript versions. There would come a point with some of them where Ivan would put together what we call a clamshell manuscript. This is for the book English Creek. And English Creek is the first of his Montana trilogy. It's probably his most popular first novel. And so within this you have, again, a trove of information about how the writer works. You have notes, changes. You have things like stet. You have, and of course that means keep this as I say, to the editor, to the publisher. And he was very, very engaged in the multiple iterations of each book because he was very concerned that it be right. In the 2000s, he began to have serious medical issues that were very concerning. And one of the things that we want to have very plain in the archive is the medical journey that he went through in the last 15 or so years of his life, where he was suffering with multiple myeloma during some of that time. And parts of the archive really lay out for us how he felt during this time, what he thought of it, what it did to his way of thinking about the world, his writing. And his widow, Carol Doig, is very interested in having people able to access his medical records, which is something that is normally not allowed in an archive for legal reasons. We have permission to have these items and to have the public have access to them digitally as well as physically here in special collections. And his final 4 books, in fact, come out when he is under what is in effect a death sentence of multiple myeloma. The Bartender's Tale is published in 2012, Sweet Thunder is published in 2013, and his final book, Last Bus to Wisdom, comes out posthumously in 2015. All these are works of fiction, very imaginative works, and those of us who look at the archive can only dream of what it must have been like to be on these incredibly invasive drugs and procedures and yet do this amazing work. So as a man who was pathologically diligent all his life, that ability to work through anything served him well in the last years of his life as he was suffering from multiple myeloma. We have evidence in some of the note cards he was working on. So he has cards that make sort of poetic sentences. He talks about being a human pill bottle at one point. He talks about Dex turns my brain into a list, among other things. Dex is short for one of the drugs that he was on. We also have some of the actual records. We have a very articulate man talking about the effects of certain drugs on his body, which I think is incredibly and helpful in some ways, how he feels taking certain drugs and what it does to his voice, what it does to his brain, his body, his ability to coordinate his own movements. At one point he is writing, I am a writer of fiction, an activity that takes all of the mental acuity I've got. Could this, the 3-part treatment or any part of it, permanently alter my intellectual ability or my ability to concentrate? And so he's talking about the process that he's going to be going through as they treat this very invasive, serious cancer. He dies in April of 2015, and so we know that he's very near the end at this point, but he's still working away. He's still doing the writer's job.
Ivan Doig is an incredibly beloved author in Montana. When we do events, public events, people show up in large numbers. Even when we go out of state to Washington, for instance, we did an alumni event in Spokane. A large number of people showed up because so many of them have read his works. And Ivan, I think, really gives voice to the working people of Montana. He grew up in very humble conditions in a sheep herder family, and he knows what the rancher life is like. He knows what it's like to live in rural areas, and he writes about that, and that's very appealing. He also describes people and describes landscapes very effectively, and so I think that's a big part of his appeal.
He's a writer of place, and I think there's a lot of interest now in that kind of writing. A lot of interest from all the way from young writers to older people who knew the life that he's actually writing about. I was very happy to see at our events that it is the community that comes. He has less of an academic following and much more of a sort of common person, common reader following. And so when you look out in the audience of an event, you see regular people, not academics necessarily, though some are there. And that's very refreshing to me to see that. And wherever I go in the community to talk about his work, to discuss his works, people will say, my family knew Ivan Doig's mother, or knew his grandmother, or I was his doctor. And so it's a wonderful touchstone to have this in the community.